It all started on a quiet Saturday morning, the kind where the world feels peaceful and ordinary. My dog, Max, a loyal German shepherd with gentle eyes and a protective spirit, bounded across the backyard, chasing after his favorite ball. For me, Max wasn't just a pet. It was family. He had been there through my toughest days, offering comfort without asking for anything in return. But to Karen, the HOA president, Max was a problem waiting to happen. Karen had ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist for years. She was the self-appointed guardian of property values, armed with a clipboard, a whistle, and an unshakable belief that her word was law. To her, every blade of grass, every paint color, and every fence height was a matter of control. And now, apparently, my dog had fallen into her crosshairs. The first sign of trouble arrived in a crisp white envelope tucked under my doormat. At first, I thought it was the usual HOA newsletter, filled with hollow pleasantries and endless lists of rules. But as I unfolded the paper, my stomach dropped. It was a notice of violation, citing me for keeping a restricted animal in violation of HOA policy. The notice demanded that Max be removed from the property within 30 days, or I would face escalating fines and potential legal action. Shock turned to anger as I read the words over and over again. Max wasn't dangerous, nor was he some exotic creature. He was a registered service animal, trained to provide emotional support and stability after a personal hardship I had endured years ago. But Karen didn't care about that. All she cared about was control. To her, Max was a symbol of defiance, a reminder that not everything in the neighborhood bent to her will. Over the next few days, Karen escalated her campaign. She made her rounds through the neighborhood, stopping to whisper in driveways, telling anyone who would listen that my dog was a liability. She warned parents that Max was unpredictable, planting seeds of fear in their minds, and she began sending wave after wave of violation notices, each more aggressive than the last. At first, I tried to ignore her, hoping the storm would blow over. But Karen thrived on conflict. Ignoring her only made her push harder. Soon, I found myself facing hundreds of dollars in fines, all for refusing to give up the one companion who had never let me down. The pressure mounted. Some neighbors, swayed by Karen's influence, began to avoid me. Children who once played fetch with Max now crossed the street when they saw him. Others, however, quietly voiced their support, slipping notes of encouragement into my mailbox or offering sympathetic smiles as I walked Max down the block. It was clear that the neighborhood was being divided not by Max, but by Karen's relentless thirst for control. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood in the yard watching Max curl up by the fence, completely unaware of the battle that was being waged over his existence. That was the moment I knew I couldn't back down. Karen wanted me to surrender, to bow to her authority, but I refused. Max wasn't just a dog. He was my family, my lifeline, and my anchor. If Karen thought she could bully me into submission, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. This wasn't just about Max anymore. It was about standing up 2 years of intimidation, about finally drawing the line in the sand. And so, the fight began. The notices kept coming. Each one was thicker, stamped in bold red ink, carrying an increasing sense of urgency. First, they were warnings. Then came fines. Then threats of legal action. Karen wasn't just trying to intimidate me, she was trying to bury me under paper, hoping I'd fold from the pressure. She had always been relentless, but now, with Max as her target, she seemed almost obsessed. Neighbors whispered about how often she brought him up at HOA meetings, describing him as aggressive and a danger to the community. She exaggerated every bark, every time he leaned on the fence, spinning harmless moments into horror stories. Those who didn't know Max personally began to doubt. After all, Karen's voice carried weight, especially when backed by her title. But the truth was simpler than the lies she spread. Max wasn't aggressive. He wasn't dangerous. He was a service animal, certified and legally protected. Karen didn't care about the law, thought only about control. To her, rules were weapons to be twisted and wielded, and she was sharpening them against me. I decided I couldn't just sit back anymore. I started gathering my own paperwork, Max's registration, letters from my doctor, and copies of federal laws protecting service animals. I built a file thicker than the violation notices she piled against me. Every time she pushed, I pulled back harder. Meanwhile, Karen escalated her campaign beyond paper. One afternoon, I found a group of board members standing at the edge of my yard, clipboards in hand, jotting notes as Max trotted by. They didn't speak to me, didn't knock, didn't explain. They just observed, like investigators at a crime scene. Later that week, Karen distributed flyers, claiming the HOA was conducting a safety review of my property. She wanted the neighborhood to see me not as a neighbor, but as a threat. It worked on some. Parents whispered nervously at the park. Kids who once loved to pet Max now tugged at their mother's sleeves to leave early. But there were others who saw through the performance. A few neighbors began stopping by with encouraging words, telling me stories of their own run-ins with Karen, of how she had fined them for lawn decorations or threatened to sue over mailbox paint. Max had simply become her newest excuse to flex power. The real turning point came at a community gathering. Karen, in her usual fashion, took the stage with her clipboard and microphone, launching into a speech about preserving neighborhood safety. She pointed at me, naming me outright as someone putting the community at risk. The crowd turned their heads, some with sympathy, others with curiosity, but the spotlight was on me now. That was the night I made a decision. If Karen wanted to fight, she was going to get one. But it wasn't going to be in whispered arguments or piles of fines. It was going to be in the one place she could indeed twist the rules. The courtroom. I called my attorney the very next morning, handing over the binder I had prepared with every detail, every law, every scrap of evidence. Karen wanted to frame me as reckless. I was going to show her for what she truly was, a tyrant misusing her power. Still, I knew Karen wouldn't back off easily, and as the legal gears began turning, I could feel the neighborhood tension rising. Karen had been challenged, and if there was one thing she hated more than being defied, it was being exposed. She was about to double down, and I was ready. Karen didn't take my legal move quietly. To her, my attorney's letter wasn't just resistance, it was rebellion, and rebellion, in Karen's world, had to be crushed quickly and publicly. Within a week, she escalated her tactics. Patrols began walking past my property more frequently, clipboard in hand, snapping photographs of my yard, my mailbox, even the car in my driveway. Officially, they were documenting potential violations. In reality, they were gathering ammunition for Karen's crusade. She wanted me overwhelmed, suffocated by technicalities. But she underestimated one thing. The neighborhood was starting to wake up. For years, people had tolerated her antics, chalking them up to just Karen being Karen. Now, seeing how far she was willing to go over a single dog, some began to question whether she had finally crossed the line. At the park, whispers spread quickly. One neighbor mentioned how Karen had fined them $100 for leaving Halloween decorations up a day too long. Another remembered the time she threatened to repaint their shutters at the homeowner's expense, because the shade of blue was antique. One story after another poured out, each one exposing the pattern. Karen thrived on intimidation, and most had simply bowed their heads to keep the peace. But my fight wasn't so easily silenced, and the louder it became, the more people started to listen. Of course, not everyone was on my side. Karen had loyalists, neighbors who either feared her wrath or genuinely believed her version of order. They repeated her lies about Max, warning parents to keep children away, whispering that I was selfish for putting the community at risk. These were the same voices who had defended her fines, her bans, and her endless campaigns of control. To them, Karen wasn't a tyrant. It was the glue that kept the neighborhood from falling apart. The divide grew sharper with every passing day. Some waved at me warmly as I walked to Max, slipping quiet words of encouragement. Others turned their backs, crossing the street with pointed glares. My once ordinary daily walk had become a silent battleground, every glance a reminder of the lines being drawn. Karen thrived in this division. She stood taller at HOA meetings, her speeches sharper and louder, using fear as her hammer. She painted me as the villain, a man who cared more about his dangerous animal than the well-being of his neighbors. She repeated those words, dangerous animal, until they became her mantra. But while Karen was busy fanning flames, I was gathering water. My attorney had begun preparing the case, building it brick by brick, law by law, federal protections for service animals, medical documentation, community testimonies. It was all stacking up in my favor. For every flyer she distributed, I had a piece of evidence ready to dismantle it. For every fine she issued, I had proof of its illegitimacy. Still, the emotional toll was heavy. Each night, as I watched Max rest by the fireplace, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the battle pressing down on me. He didn't understand the hostility, the cold stares, the whispered fears. All he knew was that he was loved, that he had a home, and that I would do anything to protect him. And that was exactly what I intended to do. The hearing date was set. Karen had her stage, and I had mine. Soon, this would no longer be about flyers and fines. It would be about truth laid bare in front of a judge. But Karen wasn't one to go down quietly. As the date approached, she began preparing her most aggressive push yet. She wasn't just aiming to remove Max anymore. She wanted to break me entirely, to make me an example to anyone else who dared to stand in her way. And when Karen pushed hardest, the whole neighborhood would feel it. As the hearing date crept closer, Karen unleashed her most aggressive campaign yet. She could sense her grip on the community slipping, and she poured every ounce of her energy into tightening it back. To her, this wasn't just about me or Max. Anymore, it was about power, image, and control. The retaliation began with money. Suddenly, I was slapped with a barrage of back dues and administrative fees, charges that had no basis in reality. The sums ballooned into the thousands, each letter arriving with language designed to terrify. Liens, foreclosure, property seizure. Karen wanted to bleed me dry financially before I ever set foot in court. Then came the surveillance. HOA volunteers, handpicked by Karen, were stationed at the edge of my street. They logged when I left the house, when Max was walked, even how long he spent in the yard. Neighbors reported seeing Karen herself, parked in her car across from my property, scribbling in her ever-present notebook. It wasn't oversight, it was harassment. And still, she escalated further. At one HOA meeting, Karen pushed through a temporary emergency ordinance, banning all animals over 50 pounds from the community, citing safety concerns. It was aimed squarely at Max, though the ordinance had no real legal standing. The message was clear. She was willing to rewrite the rules themselves if that's what it took to force me out. The neighborhood's divide deepened. Her loyalists applauded the ordinance, praising her for keeping families safe. But others were outraged, questioning why so much energy was being poured into targeting a single dog when the community had bigger issues like the broken playground, equipment, or the street lights that hadn't worked in months. The murmurs of discontent grew louder. I kept my focus. Every threatening letter, every ordinance, every piece of harassment went straight into my attorney's growing file. Karen thought she was burying me in paperwork, but she was really building the case that would expose her. Her overreach, her obsession, her abuse of power, it was all being documented in meticulous detail. Yet despite the preparation, the pressure was real. Walk-in Max became an act of defiance. Parents tugged their children away, muttering under their breath. The guards Karen had hired for neighborhood security began tailing me on my evening walks, their presence meant to intimidate. Each night, I felt the weight of her campaign pressing harder, and each night I reminded myself why I couldn't give in. Max wasn't just a dog. He was the embodiment of freedom from Karen's tyranny. If she succeeded in taking him, she wouldn't stop there. She'd be emboldened, free to extend her control unchecked, while the neighborhood sank deeper into silence and fear. The storm reached its peak one evening when Karen staged her boldest stunt yet. She arrived at my property with 2 board members and a hired officer, claiming they had authority to remove Max immediately for violating HOA rules. She waved papers in the air, declaring him a threat. Neighbors gathered, some filming on their phones, others whispering nervously. But I stood firm. I knew her papers meant nothing in the eyes of the law. The officer, after reviewing the documents, refused to act without a court order. Karen's face burned red, her fury spilling into a tirade that echoed down the street. That night, the entire neighborhood saw what I had known all along. This wasn't about safety or rules. This was about Karen's obsession with control. And with that, the battle lines were drawn sharper than ever. The court date was set. The evidence was ready, and Karen had exposed herself for what she truly was. The fight was about to move out of the neighborhood and into the courtroom, where her power wouldn't protect her anymore. The day of the hearing arrived like a storm that had been building for weeks. The courthouse buzzed with tension, neighbors whispering in the hallway, curious to see how the feud that had consumed the entire community would finally unfold. For Karen, this was her stage. She strutted into the room in her signature blazer, clutching binders stuffed with documents, flanked by 2 loyal board members. Her glare swept across the room, landing on me with the same fire she had carried from the very beginning. I sat with my attorney, calm but resolute. The stack of evidence we carried was thicker than hers, built from every violation notice, every false fine, every ordinance she had twisted. And, most importantly, it contained the official certification of Max as a service animal on irrefutable shield against her attacks. The judge called the case, and Karen wasted no time. She launched into her speech, her words sharp and theatrical. She painted Max as a menace, claiming he lunged at children, barked late into the night, and terrorized neighbors. Each story was more exaggerated than the last, a carefully woven narrative designed to strike fear. Her binders were waved around as if they were holy scripture, filled with photographs taken from odd angles and statements from her most loyal followers. But the cracks began to show almost immediately. My attorney dissected each claim with precision. When Karen claimed Max had no legal protections, the federal statutes were presented. When she insisted I was delinquent on dues, my receipts proved otherwise. When she accused me of ignoring HOA rules, permits and letters contradicted her. Then came the witnesses. One by one, neighbors stood and testified. Some spoke of how Max had never shown aggression, how he was gentle with her children and beloved on the block before Karen's campaign began. Others revealed their own battles with Karen unfair fines, harassing letters, even threats of foreclosure over trivial issues. What was meant to be a case against me transformed into a broader indictment of Karen's leadership. The judge listened intently, his expression growing firmer as each testimony chipped away at Karen's story. Her attempt to dominate the courtroom with intimidation backfired. The more she spoke, the more desperate she appeared. Her composure cracked, her voice rose, and her words turned into angry rants. By the time my attorney presented the final piece of evidence, Max's service animal registration, backed by medical documentation, the case was sealed. The law was clear, and Karen's crusade had no legal ground to stand on. When the ruling came, it was decisive. The judge dismissed every violation and fine related to Max, ordered the HOA to cease harassment, and even mandated an audit of the HOA's finances in light of the numerous complaints raised during testimony. Karen's face flushed crimson, her fury barely contained as the gavel struck the desk. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, a mix of relief and satisfaction. Neighbors who had been silent for years finally felt a sense of justice. Karen stormed out, clutching her binders. Her authority diminished, her image shattered. But for me, the moment wasn't about her, it was about Max. Watching him wag his tail as I returned home that evening, I knew we had won something greater than just a legal battle. We had won freedom from fear, proof that standing up to tyranny, no matter how small or petty, was worth every ounce of effort. Yet even as I savored the victory, I knew Karen wasn't finished. People like her rarely walked away quietly. She had lost in court, but in her mind, she still had the neighborhood, and that meant one final act of desperation was on the horizon. After the courtroom loss, Karen's once iron grip on the neighborhood began to crumble. The judgment had stripped her of credibility, but Karen was not the type to fade quietly. She doubled down, sending out newsletters laced with veiled insults, portraying herself as a martyr who had been wronged by an ungrateful community. She stalked the sidewalks in the evenings, clipboard in hand, still searching for the smallest infractions to write up. But this time the neighborhood was no longer afraid. The court case had awakened something in everyone, an understanding that Karen's rule had never been about order, but control. One by one, neighbors who had once cowered now stood taller, their voices louder. Petitions circulated, demanding her resignation. Yard signs began appearing, each one bolder than the last. New leadership, new community. The HOA meetings that had once been dominated by Karen's sharp tongue turned into battlegrounds she could no longer win. Where she had once spoken over others, now she was met with raised hands, pointed questions, and unwavering opposition. The more she tried to silence dissent, the more it grew. Her allies on the board, once loyal out of fear or favoritism, began to distance themselves. They saw the writing on the wall. The audit ordered by the court uncovered questionable expenses, lavish dinners charged to the HOA, administrative fees with no receipts, and fines collected without proper documentation. The whispers of corruption became shouts. Finally, the community called for a vote of no confidence. On that night, the meeting hall overflowed. Every chair filled, neighbors spilling into the aisles. Karen sat at the head of the table, her composure strained, her eyes darting nervously across the crowd. For the first time, she was outnumbered. When the ballots were counted, the result was undeniable. By an overwhelming margin, Karen was removed as HOA president. The room erupted with cheers, the weight of years of oppression lifting in a single moment. Karen stood, trembling with rage, but her words were drowned out by applause. She left the hall in silence, her clipboard clutched like a lifeline, but her reign was over. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. The new board rolled back unfair fines, restored access to common spaces, and introduced policies that favored fairness over control. Barbecues returned to backyards, children played freely in the streets, and dogs, including Max, roamed happily without fear of retaliation. The community was no longer ruled, it was united. As for Karen, she became a shadow, retreating into her house, blinds drawn, the once feared figure, now just another neighbor. Her attempts to reclaim power fizzled, her voice drowned out by the solidarity of those she had tried to control. For me, the victory wasn't just personal. It was proof that one person's courage to stand up could inspire an entire community to break free. Max, oblivious to the storm he had sparked, lounged in the yard, his tail wagging lazily in the afternoon sun. Watching him, I realized the fight had never truly been about him. It had been about all of us, about reclaiming dignity from someone who had taken it for far too long. In the end, Karen demanded my dog be removed. Instead, she was the one removed, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood finally felt like home again.